If you really look into it, fossils don't speak. And if they do, you should probably go see a psychiatrist, right?
Well, man, I want to get to a discussion section of the show. You studied science, and one of the things we wanted to speak about on the show is the creation versus evolution, or how does creation and science, how do they coincide? And we kind of talked about that, but I want to share with dads, why it's important that we start with God, even in the area of science, and don't hand our children over to the secular worldview of millions of years or evolution or the Big Bang. Why is that important that we start with the foundation of God and kind of talk about the differences and how even the idea of millions of years and evolution and things evolving, how that breaks certain laws of that are in thermodynamics and different things, how it doesn't work out. So maybe you can, you know a lot about that. Why don't you tell us a bit what you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think it's tremendously important to go back to Genesis, to what God's Word actually says, because unfortunately in our Christian community, a lot of the times our kids do have these challenging questions, like what about the dinosaurs? What about radiocarbon dating? What about radiometric dating? What about all these different things? What about when I see these things on television saying that we're just highly evolved apes, that we have a common ancestor between us, the apes, and the monkeys, and being able to have those answers for them so that they don't go out and try to figure it out on their own and go down these paths that aren't going to be based on God's Word, based on the biblical foundation. So it's tremendously important as parents, as fathers, we be able to instruct them from God's Word. And that's why the ministry of Answers in Genesis is so valuable, so awesome. They have a ton of information out there on all these different questions, about, because I think one of the number one questions kids always have is, what about the dinosaurs? What happened to them? We have to look back in Genesis. What happened? There was a worldwide flood. There was a global flood of Noah's days, and if you look at it through that biblical worldview, the science makes sense. Everything we see makes sense. We see billions of dead things covered by water rapidly all over the world. Yeah. And you're going to hear a lot of different things as well, like just let the evidence speak for itself. Let the science, let the fossil record speak for itself.
Right. Don't bring God into it.
Yeah,
let's look at this.
That's what you're going to hear a lot from the secular world. But if you really look into it, fossils don't speak, and if they do, you should probably go see a psychiatrist, right? Like if you have bones talking to you, that's probably a problem.
They're probably speaking the language you speak too.
Yeah. And that's why a worldview is so important. Yes. Essentially, when you see things in the news like, well, science says this, science says that. No, science doesn't say anything. Science is a tool, it's a method, it's knowledge. Scientists interpreting the evidence that way has said this,
right,
based on their assumptions, based on their worldview, because we all look at the evidence. It's all the same evidence, the same bones, the same rock layers, but we have a different worldview.
Right.
We start with a biblical worldview.
Right.
Whereas the atheist, the evolutionist, will start with his assumptions, with his presuppositions.
Yes.
So we all have the same evidence that we're looking at. We can all agree that there's bones, that there's rock layers, that this was laid down. But now once you go past that, now you're getting into what's called historical science, and so we really got to differentiate what we mean by science and what that actually means. So there's essentially two different categories. We have observational science, like
and real quick with worldview, what we're essentially saying is you're looking through a lens. Your worldview shapes looking through a lens, right?
Absolutely.
And you're looking either through a Christian lens, or a creationist lens, or you're looking through a secular humanist lens, which is saying there is no God, so I have to explain this that way or interpret it that way, or you're looking at it through a biblical worldview and you're saying I'm going to explain this based on what God's word says and starting there. Worldview.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes down to man's word versus God's word. Really, that's the ultimate foundation here. That's the ultimate thing that we're dealing with. What's going to be your authority? Is it going to be what man says? Does man determine truth? Does man define truth?
Yes.
Or does it come down to the all-knowing, inerrant, omnipresent, omnipowerful God who actually sustains this world, sustains this universe by the power of his word? And
so I didn't want to get you off, though. So you were saying the difference between observational science and historical science. So tell us about that, because I'd like to hear about that.
That's a big one. So as you're training up your kids as a father, you need to really make sure you define those terms for them, because they're going to hear science buzzwords all the time when they're out there in the world, from the secular media, from the news. So you really got to differentiate observational science, which is your typical method, scientific method. It has to be testable, observable, it has to be repeatable. You essentially set up a hypothesis, you set up your tests, you make your results, and it's basically what sends up rockets to the International Space Station. It's how we get men onto the moon. It's all great observational science.
Which evolution is not observational, because you can never observe that, right?
That's correct, because they look at these things through their evolutionary worldview, and you have to make assumptions, right? Now you're going into historical science. Now you're having to, and with evolution, with different dating methods, you're also mixing in observational science as well, because you're having to do the chemistry tests on whatever the specimen is. For example, like if you're trying to figure out the age of a rock, you're using observational science to try to test it.
So dating something is observational.
Well, yeah, to that point, just being able to actually test it. But past that, when you start bringing in assumptions into it, for example, like the radiometric dating, now you're getting into the realm of historical science. Now you're having to say, you're depending on uniformity, that the rates have always been the same in the past, so just an example with the radiometric dating, they typically have what's called parent and they have daughter isotopes. So when you look in the world, you see different elements over time. They will decay into more stable elements. So for example, uranium will decay into lead over time. So they look at these different things and they say, okay, if I can test that this element will decay over this time frame, I can just extrapolate that and just say, well, if I find this many parent isotopes, this many daughter ones, I can make an assumption and say, based on that ratio, this is how old this piece of rock is. But they fail to really understand the assumptions behind that. How many parent, how many daughter isotopes were there from the beginning? Has the rate of change always been constant? And has anything affected that ratio as well?
So you're saying bridging the gap is the historical science.
So trying to understand things that happened in the past. Now you're going into historical science because nobody was there to observe it. There's no one there to test it.
So you make assumptions. Is that what you're saying in that part of science?
But the cool thing is as Christians, we know and we realize there was someone there that saw it all happen, and that's why we have to stand on God's word. It's like looking at a famous building like the Eiffel Tower, for example. With observational science, we can determine how tall the tower is. We can determine where it's located. We can determine how big it is, what the size of it, what type of material it has. But how do we actually know when it was built? How do we know who built the tower? We have to now go back to historical records to see that. So in our case, we got to go back to the history of it. We got to go back to Genesis, and Genesis is actual history. It's not just a poetic piece of literature. It's actually written in a historical manner. And so that's how we have to see how to get these answers. And so when we're raising up our children, we need to be able to get back to that, have the answers that they need for those kind of things. And because no doubt they're going to be experiencing that in the world. And it's just going to be a tremendous blow to their faith if you don't have the answers and you just give them kind of like these lukewarm answers of just have faith, right? Just believe in Jesus.
Yeah, we don't have to have any, we don't have any intelligence behind this. We just have blind faith.
And
that's
going to be super damaging for your child. And that's why it's so important that that as fathers we get trained up, we get that knowledge as soon as possible.
This addition versus submission. Sinners need forgiveness. Surrender to his lordship. Don't extort the grace he's given. See, I'm blessed by the one Yahweh all day. I'm a wretched sinner, deserve hell for always.